Practice now is how to write an equation for either a sine or cosine function based off of a graph, or on these first two examples, just based off of information. So if you remember our general form, y equals a is the amplitude times your sine function or cosine function, b, which helps us figure out period, times x minus h. H is our phase shift left or right, plus k, and k is our phase shift up or down. And so we're going to write a function where the amplitude is 15, the period is 4 pi, so period, that's going to affect our b. The phase shift is pi over 2. Let's call that right pi over 2 since it's positive. And our vertical shift is negative 10. So right off, we can plug in the easy stuff. Our amplitude is 15. We know it's a sine function. The b, we're going to hold off on b for just a minute. Our phase shift is right pi over 2, so that's x minus pi over 2. And we're vertically going down 10. So that's a minus 10 on the back. So now let's talk about b. Typically, our period for sine and cosine of the parent function is 2 pi. And to figure out what b is, normally we know we know b and we're trying to figure out the period. So our formula that we had for figuring out the period was 2 pi divided by b. But now we know the period and we don't know what b is. So I know my period is 4 pi. We're trying to figure out b. So you can solve this equation for b to get that b is 1/2. And I'm just going to leave my answer like that, or you can distribute that 1/2. That's how it's usually seen. Written would be y equals 15 sine of 1/2 x minus pi over 4 minus 10. But it's not wrong to leave it in this form right here. So this cosine function is going to be really similar. So plugging in the stuff that's easy, we know amplitude is 0.5. This is a cosine function. B takes a little bit more effort, so let me hold off on that. The phase shift is negative pi over 3. I'm going to, instead of negative, I'm going to say that says left pi over 3, which means we would have x plus pi over 3. And then if we're going up 5, that's a plus 5 on the back. So again, typically to find a period, we take 2 pi, 2 pi is our period for the parent function of sine and cosine, divided by b. So since our period is pi over 3, we need to figure out what b is to give us a period of pi over 3. So b is 6. And plug that in. And that would be our equation. So now let's do the same thing, but looking from a graph instead. I'm going to skip around on these. So all graphs can be written, all graphs, if you can write them as a sine function, you can also write them as a cosine function and vice versa. So all of these that we're going to look at could be written as a sine or a cosine. And so we're going to do that each one as both. So I'm going to do number 3. We're going to skip around a little bit though. So our amplitude, I'm going to start by figuring out midline, amplitude, and period. So our midline is the x-axis. So we're not going shifting up or down at all here. Our period, where does it start repeating itself? It repeats itself after 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi. There's no vertical shift because our midline is still the x-axis. Our amplitude is 1 because we're 1 away from our midline. We go up 1, that's our maximum, and we go down 1, -1 is our minimum. And then we have to decide if we're going to write this as a cosine function or a sine function first. I'm going to start by writing this as a cosine function. The reason being is it's not going through the origin. It's starting down here, so it's going to be a little bit easier to write this as a cosine function. The cosine function does not have a phase shift, but our sine function will have a phase shift. That's the one thing that changes between sine and cosine functions. So if I write this as a cosine function, we're starting at the bottom of the graph, which means it's going to be a negative cosine function. -1 because our amplitude is 1. To figure out b, again, our period is 2 pi. So we're going to do the same thing that we did for the first two problems here. Period is 2 pi divided by b. And so since our period was 2 pi, that means b is just 1. So our b is just 1. There's no phase shift for cosine. We're starting right where we want to. And there was no vertical shift. So this would just be our final answer in terms of cosine. However, if we're going to write this function in terms of sine, there is going to be a phase shift. And that is because sine functions typically start where the midline is. So if I want to start where the midline is, that's at pi over 2. There are actually infinitely many correct ways to write an equation for these functions. I'm just giving you one way to write the cosine function and one way to write the sine function. So if I write this as a sine function with a shift of right pi over 2, my sine function is going to be positive. There's no reflection because we're starting by going up. So it's going to be positive. Our amplitude is still 1. Our b is still 1. But our phase shift is right pi over 2. And there's no vertical shift. The only two things that might change between a cosine function and a sine function, the only two things you really have to pay attention to is one could have a reflection and one could not, or they both could have reflections, or neither one could have a reflection, depending on where you're starting from. And 2, the phase shift might change. Other than that, all the other information will stay the same. The vertical shift will stay the same because the midline will stay the same. Same with amplitude, and same with the b. Let's skip to number 5. We'll do number 5 next. So number 5, if we're doing a period, where does it restart itself? Our period is pi. And because our period is pi, and not 2 pi, pi. And to find period, we take 2 pi divided by b. That means our b must be 2. So our b is 2. Our midline is still the x-axis, so there's no vertical shift. Our amplitude is 1 again, because from the midline, we're going either up 1 or down 1. And the function that's going to be a little bit easier to start with is sine, because this does go through the origin. So if I write this as a sine function, we're starting at the origin and we're going up, so that's positive sine. Our amplitude is 1, so positive sine. Our b is 2. There is no phase shift for sine. So I don't need to have the x in parentheses. I could have just written 2x there. And there's no vertical shift, so that would be our final answer, sine of 2x. If I'm writing this as a cosine function, though, there is going to be a phase shift. And the phase shift will depend on where you want to start this. So if I want to start it right here at the top, that looks like that is right pi over 4. And cosine functions are used to starting at the top, so there's no reflection there. Everything else stays the same except our phase shift is pi over 4. Let's try another one where we do have a vertical shift. Which one do I want to do? Let's skip all the way down here to number 9. So this one, our midline does change. Let's see. We're going from -6 to +2. So our midline is right in between those. So that means there is a vertical shift down to. Our amplitude is 4 because we're going up 4 from that midline and down 4 from that midline. Our period, how often does the graph repeat itself? Let's see. From 0 to pi over 2. So our period is pi over 2. And if our period is pi over 2, let's do some math real fast. That means our B is 4. All right, so now let's decide whether it's easier to start with cosine or sine. I think it's easier to start with cosine because on the y-axis we're starting up, and that's what cosine graphs typically do. So if I'm writing my cosine graph, my amplitude is 4. It's positive 4 because we're starting up like the parent function of cosine normally does. Our b is 4. We already figured that out. There's no phase shift, so I don't want parentheses there. But we do have a vertical shift of -2. If I'm going to write this as a sine function, so sine functions typically are where the midline is. So that would be right here if we're going to do a sine function. And this did not copy well. I'd say that's probably pi over 8. Yeah, pi over 8. So we're going right pi over 8. And if we're starting at pi over 8, we're going down first. So there's also a reflection if we're talking about the sine graph. So our sine function would say -4 because we're going down first from pi over 8. Again, there are infinitely many ways you could do this correctly. I could have started from right here, for example, and then we would have gone up first. Multiple ways to do this, but -4 sine 4 is our b. We moved right pi over 8, and then we also moved down 2. Again, the only things that might possibly change is phase shift. One will have a phase shift and one will not. And then sometimes one will have a reflection and one will not. Let's look at another graph. Let's do this one down here next. And we're going to assume that each one of those tick marks on the x-axis are going up by pi over 4. So if we're looking at this first one, here's our midline down here at -1.5. So we're going down 1.5. Our amplitude from there then is 0.5 because we're going up to 1 and down, or sorry, up to -1 and down to -2. So our amplitude is 0.5. And that, again, that's because our maximum is -1, our minimum is -2, and our midline is right in between those at -1.5. Our period, how often does it repeat itself? So I'm going to start right here, and then it repeats itself right here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I said that these are going up by pi over 4, so that means our period is pi, which means our b is 2. So if we're doing a sine graph first, what's our phase shift? Sine graph typically starts at the midline. So if we're going to start the midline, we need to start right here at pi over 4. Or there are, again, multiple ways we could do this. That's just how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to move right pi over 4. And if I move right pi over 4, our graph goes up first. So this is a positive sign. So now we're going to put it all together. So y equals amplitude, and it's positive because we went up first. Sine of b is 2. Our phase shift is right pi over 4. And our vertical shift was down 1.5. All right, but if we're doing a cosine graph, our cosine graph doesn't have a phase shift at all. But we're going up, or sorry, we're starting at the bottom instead of starting at the top. So our cosine graph does have a reflection. So it'd be y equals negative 0.5 cosine of 2x, no phase shift, minus 1.5. We'll do one more for good measure. Let's do this one. So our midline, let's figure out where our middle is. Looks like it's here at 0.5. So that's our vertical shift is up 0.5. From there, our maximum is 1.5 and our minimum is negative 0.5. So that means our amplitude is 1. Both of those are 1 away from that midline. Our period, how often is it repeating itself? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tick marks. And if these are going up by pi over 4, that'd be 6 pi over 4 or 3 pi over 2. So if I need to find b from there, our period is 3 pi over 2. And typically to find period, we take 2 pi divided by b. So one way you could think about this is cross multiplying and then solving for b. So b is 4/3. Now let's talk about sine versus cosine. It's going to be a little bit easier to write this as a cosine function. So I'm actually going to do that one first. There would be no phase shift because we're starting up. And so because we're starting up, there's also no reflection. So it's going to be positive cosine. So we've got y equals our amplitude, 1, positive 1 because we started up like a cosine function normally would, the parent function normally would. Cosine of 4/3 x, and then we did shift up 0.5. If I am writing a sine function for this, sine functions typically start at the midline, which is right here in this case. Hard to see exactly where that is, so let's talk about this for a second. Within a period, things change 4 times. All right, so like a sine graph goes from midline up, midline down. It changes 4 times always. So to figure out that phase shift, I'm going to take my period and I'm going to divide that by 4. Or take 3 pi over 2 times 1/4. So that means where that first change is happening at the midline is at 3 pi over 8. And again, I'm getting that by dividing the period by 4, and that's my phase shift. And because we're going to go down first from that point, that means there is a reflection if we're talking about sine. So my sine equation is going to start off with a negative. So my phase shift was right 3 pi over 8. And y equals negative. My amplitude is 1. Sine, my b is 4/3. My phase shift is 3 pi over 8. And my graph moved 0.5 from the x-axis.